The mud came first. It always did in late 1944, thick and black across the killing fields of Europe, swallowing boots and tracks and hope alike. Not the clean earth of home, but something ancient and malevolent, mixed with ash and blood and the pulverized remains of 1,000 villages. It clung to everything, dragged at tank tracks, turned roads into rivers of filth. Men slept in it, fought in it, died in it. The cold followed, bone deep, seeping through wool and steel until men couldn't tell where their flesh ended and the metal began. November cold in France. December cold in Belgium. The kind of cold that made rifles jam and diesel fuel gel and fingers turn black with frostbite. And beneath it all, in the frozen foxholes and shattered villages from Normandy to the Siegfried Line, defeat hung in the air like cordite smoke that wouldn't clear. German tank crews laughed that winter. They had earned it. They'd earned it in blood and fire and the wreckage of American armor that littered every road from the beaches to the German border. For months, their Tigers and Panthers had ruled every crossroad, every ridge, every desperate American advance. The mathematics of it were brutal and simple. A Tiger could kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. A Sherman had to get within 200 yards to have a chance at a Tiger, and even then, only from the side or rear. So the Shermans came in waves, brave, doomed waves, and burned like paper lanterns against the German 88s. The Americans called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter. Lights first time, every time. Dark humor for darker days, the kind of jokes men made when the alternative was screaming. German gunners kept score, carved kill marks into their turrets like fighter pilots, and shared stories over schnapps about the little American tanks that died so easily. 5 Shermans for 1 Tiger. It was practically doctrine. 10 Shermans, and some Tiger crews lost count. They had heard rumors, of course. Whispered through intelligence reports and interrogated prisoners, stories about a new American gun. A 90mm, they said. Bigger than the 76mm the newer Shermans carried. Bigger punch. Longer reach. The Germans shrugged and poured another round. Let them come with their 90. Let them come with whatever they want. The Panzer wins. It always wins. It had won in Poland. In France. In Russia, at least until the winter came. And here, in the autumn of 1944, watching American tanks burn in the gray rain, German tankers felt the old confidence returning. The war might be lost, they weren't stupid, they could read a map, but the battles? The battles they still owned. But confidence, like armor, can crack. The story begins 2 years earlier, in 1942, in sterile meeting rooms in Aberdeen Proving Ground and Detroit Arsenal, rooms that smelled of stale coffee and desperation and cigarette smoke so thick it hung like fog. American ordnance engineers sat around scarred wooden tables, surrounded by ballistics charts and penetration data that told the same brutal truth over and over. Their guns couldn't kill German tanks. Not reliably. Not at range. Not before the Germans killed them first. The numbers were damning. The 75mm gun on the Sherman could barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor. The 76mm was better, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Against a Tiger? Forget it. You'd have better luck with a prayer. The meetings grew heated as summer turned to autumn. Voices rose. Fists slammed tables. Engineers who dedicated their lives to ordnance designs sat with their heads in their hands, staring at ballistics tables that might as well have been death sentences for American tankers. Bureaucrats spoke of production quotas and supply chains and the impossibility of retooling entire factories. The Sherman was in production. The factories were humming. Changing course now would cost months, maybe a year. Men would die with the old guns while they waited for the new ones. But men were dying anyway, and everyone in those rooms knew it. But buried in that chorus of frustration, a few stubborn voices pushed back. Colonel someone, the records are unclear, and maybe he preferred it that way, kept bringing up the same question: what about the 90mm anti-aircraft gun? What if we mount it on a tracked chassis? What if we build something that can reach out and touch a Tiger before it knows we're there? The responses were predictable. The 90mm was meant for shooting down bombers, not dueling with the Wehrmacht's best. The recoil would be enormous. The weight would be prohibitive. Where would you even mount such a gun? How would you train the crews? How would you supply the ammunition? Valid questions, all of them. But desperation has a way of overruling doctrine, and by late 1942, desperation was the only strategy left. Late-night sessions began in design bureaus across America. In Detroit, engineers sketched turret profiles on scrap paper, calculated recoil forces on slide rules worn smooth with use, argued over armor thickness versus mobility, while the midnight shift changed outside their windows. Every design choice was a compromise, every compromise a gamble with men's lives. Make the armor too thick and the chassis can't handle the weight. Make it too thin and German guns will slice through it like tissue paper. Make the turret too big, and you can't traverse it fast enough. Make it too small and the crew can't load the ammunition. The margins were razor thin. Factory workers in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Cleveland pulled double shifts, then triple shifts, sleeping in break rooms because going home wasted precious hours. They welded prototypes that looked more like science experiments than weapons of war, machines cobbled together from Sherman hulls and borrowed parts and desperate innovation. The first attempts were disasters. Turret rings that cracked under the gun's recoil. Suspensions that collapsed under the weight. Breech mechanisms that jammed after 3 shots. But they kept trying because giving up meant accepting that American tanks would keep burning, that American boys would keep dying in machines they called death traps, with a fatalism that broke your heart. Test crews, volunteers who knew exactly how dangerous this was, fired the early versions at Aberdeen and felt their teeth rattle, felt the whole chassis shudder like it might tear itself apart. The noise was incredible, a deep boom that you felt in your chest cavity, that made your ears ring for hours afterward. They fired again. And again. Adjustments were made. The gun worked. The question was whether they could build a machine around it that would survive combat long enough to matter. Through 1943, as American forces struggled through North Africa and Sicily, and then up the boot of Italy, the designs evolved in workshops and proving grounds back home. The T-53, the T-71, designations that meant nothing to the men bleeding in Italy but everything to the engineers racing against time and the casualty reports that arrived with horrifying regularity. Each iteration solved problems and created new ones. Each prototype brought them closer to something that might work, might survive, might give American crews a fighting chance. They mounted the 90mm on the chassis of the M10 tank destroyer, itself a compromised design from earlier in the war. They widened the turret to accommodate the massive breech and recoil mechanism, reinforced the suspension to handle the weight, redesigned the transmission, upgraded the engine. They ran calculations until their pencils wore down to nubs. They tested prototypes until they broke, then built new ones incorporating the lessons learned from failure. The work was unglamorous and exhausting and absolutely vital, though the men doing it would never see headlines or medals. They were building a weapon to kill an enemy most of them would never face, trusting that their work would matter when the shells started flying. The result wasn't pretty. It wasn't elegant. It looked like exactly what it was, a compromise between what was needed and what was possible, built by men working against a ticking clock measured in American casualties. The turret was open-topped because a proper roof would add too much weight, and there wasn't time to redesign the whole damn thing. It left crews exposed to artillery and snipers and the elements, but that was a calculated risk. Better to have a gun that could kill tigers and deal with the exposure than to have another tank that burned easily. The armor was thin, just enough to stop rifle rounds, maybe shrapnel if God was feeling generous, maybe a glancing hit from something small. A direct hit from a German 88? The crew wouldn't have time to know they were dead. But that 90mm gun jutted forward like a promise, like a prayer, like vengeance waiting to be delivered. 54 calibers long, meaning the barrel was 54 times the diameter of the bore. That length gave the shell velocity, and velocity gave it killing power. The numbers were impressive even on paper. Muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, penetration of over 200 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. In theory, it could punch through the frontal armor of a tiger. In theory, it could kill a panther at ranges where the panther couldn't effectively shoot back. Theory was one thing. Combat was another. But it was the best theory American ordnance had produced yet. In the autumn of 1944, the first production models rolled off the lines at Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan. They called it the M36 Jackson, though the crews would mostly just call it the 90, or the big gun, or when things got bad, the death trap with the cannon. The name didn't matter. What mattered was getting them to Europe, getting them into the fight, getting them to the men who needed them before more Shermans burned. Young American soldiers, farm boys from Iowa who'd never seen anything bigger than a John Deere tractor, mechanics from Brooklyn who knew engines but had never fired a gun in anger, college kids who'd been studying literature or engineering 6 months ago and now were studying how to kill, received their assignments to tank destroyer battalions. They trained on the M36S at Fort Hood and Camp Hood in the Texas heat, learning the intricacies of the 90mm gun, the loading procedures, the aiming points on German armor. The instructors were veterans from North Africa and Sicily, men who'd seen what German tanks could do, men who taught with an urgency that made the trainees' blood run cold. "You get one shot," the instructor said. "Maybe 2 if you're lucky. Miss and you're done. The Germans don't miss." The crews climbed into the M36S for the first time, their hands trembling on cold steel that still smelled of factory oil and fresh paint and possibility. The metal felt too thin under their fingers, even though they'd been told the specifications, even though they understood the trade-offs. The open turret felt like an invitation to every German shell in France, a target painted on their backs. They sat in the gunner's seat and stared through the sight, imagining a tiger in the crosshairs, imagining what it would feel like when the gun fired, imagining what it would feel like if they missed. Their officers gathered them around after training exercises, voices low and urgent, trying to instill confidence without lying. "This gun can kill a tiger before he even sees you. This is what we've been waiting for. This is how we even the odds." The crews nodded. They wanted to believe. God, they wanted to believe. But they'd heard promises before, watched Shermans burn before, bury friends before. They'd believe it when they saw it, when they felt the gun recoil and watched a tiger explode through their own eyes. The M36S moved up to the front in November, shipped across the Atlantic in convoy, unloaded at Cherbourg or Marseille, driven through shattered French villages and muddy Belgian roads, joining units that had been fighting since D-Day or Dragoon. The journey was its own education in war's reality. Every village they passed through had been beautiful once. Now they were rubble and burned-out buildings and civilians with hollow eyes who watched the American tanks roll by with expressions that held no hope, no joy, just the weary acknowledgement that more fighting was coming and they'd be caught in the middle of it again. The veterans, men who'd landed on the beaches, fought through the hedgerows, bled for every mile from the Channel to the German border, looked at the new tank destroyers with skepticism born of bitter experience. Another wonder weapon! Another promise from men who'd never faced an 88. They'd seen the new Shermans with the 76mm guns, supposed to be better than the 75mm. They were better. They still burned. So the veterans watched the M36S roll up and kept their mouths shut and their expectations low, because hope was dangerous in this war and disappointment killed you slower than German shells but just as surely. The crews inside the M36S felt the weight of those stares, felt the doubt radiating from men who'd earned the right to doubt everything. They felt their own fear coiling in their guts like barbed wire, sharp and constant. They cleaned the 90mm obsessively, loading and reloading practice rounds until their hands moved automatically, muscle memory that might save their lives when fear froze their minds. They tried not to think about the open top, tried not to imagine what a German 88 would do to their thin armor, tried not to calculate their odds and realize they weren't good. At night, wrapped in whatever blankets they could scrounge, they lay awake and listened to the distant rumble of artillery, and wondered if tomorrow would be the day they found out if the gun really worked, or if they'd just been sold another lie wrapped in steel. The first engagement came on a gray morning in eastern France, the kind of morning where the fog hung low and thick enough that you couldn't see 50 yards. Sergeant Herbert Goldberg's crew had been in position since before dawn, their M36 tucked into a destroyed barn that offered concealment if not protection. The loader, a kid from Pennsylvania named Morrison, kept checking his watch every 5 minutes like the time would tell him when death was coming. The gunner, DeMarco, had his eye pressed to the sight so long his face had gone numb. The driver sat at his controls with the engine idling, ready to move the instant Goldberg gave the word. And Goldberg himself stood in the commander's position, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the fog for movement, for shapes, for anything that would tell him whether they'd live through the next hour. Then the fog shifted, just for a moment, and there it was, the distinctive angular silhouette of a panther, low and predatory, moving through a gap in the American lines like it owned the earth beneath its tracks. Behind it, a second panther, following in trace. Range, 600 yards. Combat doctrine, written by men who'd never seen a tiger, said wait until they're closer, make sure of the shot. But combat doctrine was written for smaller guns, for weapons that had to get danger close to have any effect. Goldberg made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. Target, Panther, range 600, Sabo. His voice was steady, calmer than he felt, because that's what commanders do. DeMarco lined up the shot, his hands moving through the procedures they'd drilled 1,000 times in Texas heat. Morrison had the round loaded, a high-velocity armor-piercing round that cost more than some cars back home. Up, Morrison said, meaning the gun was loaded and ready. DeMarco breathed once, twice, let half the air out of his lungs the way the manual said, squeezed the trigger. The 90mm roared. The sound was different, deeper, angrier, more primal than the 75mm they'd grown used to, more violent than the 76mm they'd heard on the new Shermans. It was the sound of American industry and engineering and desperation condensed into a single thunderous moment. The whole M36 rocked back on its suspension. The muzzle blast kicked up dust and debris from the barn floor. The concussion was like getting hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. The Panther erupted. Not a penetration, not a hit, an eruption. The turret lifted 6 inches into the air as ammunition cooked off inside, flame and smoke and pieces of men gushing from every hatch. The secondary explosion was so violent it blew the track off one side. The burning tank slewed to a stop, smoke pouring into the gray morning like a signal flare announcing that something had changed in this war. Goldberg's crew didn't celebrate. They didn't have time. Target, second Panther, same range, moving right to left. Morrison already had another round loaded, his hands moving on autopilot, his mind not quite believing what his eyes had just seen. DeMarco was already tracking the second Panther, which had spotted the burning hulk of its partner, and was traversing its turret, searching for the threat. The race was on. Who would fire first? The German crew, veterans who'd survived Russia and France, or the American kids who'd been in combat for less than 5 minutes? DeMarco fired. 40 seconds after the first shot, both German tanks were burning wrecks, black smoke rising in twin columns that marked the spot where German armor supremacy had started to die. The crews sat in stunned silence, cordite smoke drifting through their open turret, stinging their eyes and throats. The ringing in their ears was so loud they couldn't hear Goldberg calling for a status check. Morrison looked at his hands like he'd never seen them before. DeMarco kept his eye pressed to the sight, scanning for more targets, because if he stopped and thought about what had just happened, he might start shaking and never stop. They'd done it. The gun worked. The theory was real. The 90mm could kill Panthers. Goldberg grabbed the radio handset with fingers that wanted to tremble. Command, this is Jackson 1-6. 2 Panthers destroyed, 600 yards. The gun works. The gun works. His voice cracked on the last words, exhaustion and relief and something like joy breaking through the professional calm. On the other end, there was silence then. Say again, 1-6. Did you say destroyed? They didn't believe him. Why would they? They'd been lied to before. Words spread like wildfire through the American ranks. Not through official channels. Those were too slow, too cautious. But through the grapevine, soldier to soldier, the way all important information travels in war. The new tank destroyers can kill Panthers. They can kill Tigers. The 90 is real. It's not propaganda. It's not bullshit from headquarters. Goldberg's crew did it. 2 Panthers at 600 yards in under a minute. The gun works. Within days, more reports came in. An M36 from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion caught a Tiger I on a road in the Vosges Mountains, destroyed it with a single shot at 1,200 yards. The German crew didn't even have time to return fire. A Panther knocked out from the flank at 800 yards by a Jackson from the 654th, the round punching through the side armor like it wasn't there. Another Tiger, this one a Tiger II, the dreaded King Tiger with its nearly impenetrable frontal armor, killed by an M36 that got around to its flank and put a 90mm round through the engine compartment. The German tank burned for 3 hours. The kill marks shifted. Now it was American crews carving notches into their gun tubes, keeping score, sharing stories over cold rations and lukewarm coffee about the time the 90mm sent a Tiger's turrets spinning into a ditch, or the Panther that exploded so violently the crew in the next M36 overthought they'd been hit. The stories took on a life of their own, grew in the telling, but beneath the exaggeration was a core of truth that couldn't be denied. The balance of power on the battlefield was shifting. German intelligence picked up the reports, dismissed them as propaganda at first. American morale building, nothing more. But then more reports came, and these were from German units, from tank commanders who'd survived encounters with the new American gun, from recovery crews who'd examined the destroyed panzers and found entry holes that could only have come from something bigger than the 76mm. The intelligence officers wrote their reports with careful language, professional detachment, but between the lines you could read the concern. The Americans have a gun that can kill our heaviest tanks at combat ranges. German tankers started to hesitate. That distant ridge, was there an M36 waiting there, its long gun trained on their approach? That tree line, could a Jackson be hiding in the shadows, patient and deadly? The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For 2 years, German tank crews had owned the battlefield, had felt the Predator's confidence. Now, for the first time since the Tiger I debuted in North Africa, they felt something else: vulnerability. The hunted's fear. But the M36 crews paid a price for their power, a price written in the design compromises that made the gun possible in the first place. The thin armor meant every engagement was a gamble where the stakes were your life. Get the first shot off, or die. It was that simple, that brutal. The open turret meant rain and snow and sleet found their way inside, meant crews fought with water dripping down their necks and ice forming on the gun's breech mechanism. It meant German grenades could be dropped in from above if you weren't careful, meant artillery was a nightmare because there was no overhead protection, just the hope that the shell would land somewhere else and the prayer that God was paying attention. Artillery was the worst. Tank crews could fight tanks, that was skill, training, who saw who first. But artillery was random, impersonal, death falling from the sky with no warning except maybe a whistle if you were lucky. An 88mm air burst over an M36 was a death sentence. Shrapnel rained down into the open turret, ripping through flesh and equipment with equal indifference. Crews learned to recognize the sound of different artillery pieces, learned which ones you could ignore and which ones meant you'd better find cover immediately. They learned to hate German Nebelwerfers, the screaming meme eyes, not just for the psychological terror of their wailing rockets, but because one landing near an M36 could kill the entire crew with fragments. So they learned. God, how quickly they learned. They learned to work fast, shoot fast, move fast. Fire 2 shots, maybe 3 if you were feeling lucky or stupid, then relocate before the Germans got your position zeroed. They learned to use terrain, finding hold-on positions where only the turret was exposed, fighting from cover whenever possible. They learned to listen for the whistle of incoming rounds, learned to distinguish between the sharp crack of tank guns and the deeper crump of artillery, learned which sound meant they had a second to react, and which meant they were already dead. They learned to live with fear pressed against their spine every waking moment, to function while their hands shook, to aim while their hearts hammered against their ribs like they were trying to escape. They learned that the first rule of surviving in an M36 was simple: see them before they see you. The second rule: hit them with the first shot, because there might not be a second. The third rule: move immediately after firing, because staying still meant dying. The M36 wasn't forgiving. It had no margin for error. It demanded perfection or offered death, and the crews who survived learned to give it perfection or something close enough. Then December came, and with it, the Ardennes. And with the Ardennes came the kind of fighting that would make everything before seem like training exercises. The German offensive exploded through the winter forests on December 16 like a vision from 1940, when the panzers ruled Europe and nothing could stop them, when France fell in 6 weeks and the world watched in horror. Fog and snow covered their advance, weather so thick that Allied air power, the advantage that had ruled European skies since D-Day, was grounded, useless. 24 German divisions, including the elite SS Panzer divisions, smashed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. Tiger IIs, the dreaded King Tigers with their 88mm guns that could kill at 3 kilometers, led the spearheads, their long barrels reaching through the snow like the fingers of death. The Americans fell back in chaos and confusion. Green divisions that had never seen combat disintegrated under the assault. Veteran units found themselves surrounded, cut off, fighting for their lives. The roads clogged with refugees and retreating troops, turned into killing zones when German tanks appeared through the snow. The radio channels filled with desperate calls. Tiger tanks, coordinates. And then static. We're surrounded, request immediate. And then nothing. The maps in American headquarters showed German penetrations that shouldn't have been possible, advances that meant the whole front was collapsing. Desperate radio calls flooded American command posts as officers tried to make sense of the chaos. We need tank destroyers. We need the M36s. We need them now. We need them yesterday. Every available Jackson was rushed forward through blizzard conditions, crews exhausted before they even reached the front, driving through the night on icy roads, passing columns of American infantry retreating through the snow with that 1,000-yard stare that said they'd seen things men shouldn't see. The M36s moved toward the sound of guns that echoed like thunder through the frozen valleys, toward the orange glow on the horizon that meant something was burning, toward a battle that would define the war. The fighting in the Bulge was intimate and brutal in ways that the earlier campaigns hadn't been. This wasn't the relatively open terrain of France. This was forest fighting, close-quarters combat where visibility measured in yards, not miles. Engagement ranges collapsed to hundreds of yards, sometimes less, as opposing forces stumbled into each other through the snow and fog like blind men with knives. M36 crews fought at crossroads they couldn't name, in villages already reduced to rubble, defending positions marked only by coordinates on maps that were already outdated by the time the orders came through. They fought against German armor that appeared like ghosts from the White Curtain, Tigers and Panthers and tank destroyers of their own, jagged Panthers with guns as deadly as anything the Germans fielded. The battles were sharp and vicious. An M36 crew would be waiting in ambush, freezing in their open turret, when suddenly a Panther would appear 50 yards away, both crews spotting each other simultaneously. The next 10 seconds determined who lived and who died. Who could traverse faster? Who could load faster? Who could fire first? The survivors never forgot those moments, the absolute clarity of thought that comes when death is 10 seconds away and counting down. They fired until their ammunition ran low, the empty brass casings piling up in the turret, clinking together with a sound that became the soundtrack to their war. They pulled back when they had to, resupplied from ammunition dumps that were themselves under fire, moved forward again into the meat grinder. There was no glory here, no grand strategy visible from the crew positions. Just survival. Just killing the other bastard before he killed you. Just staying alive for one more hour, one more day, one more week in a battle that seemed like it would never end. The cold was its own enemy. Men developed frostbite sitting in their positions, lost fingers and toes to the sub-zero temperatures. The tank engines had to be run every few hours or risk the fuel gelling, the batteries dying, the whole machine becoming a 40-ton coffin. Ammunition had to be kept warm or risk misfires. Gun mechanisms froze and had to be thawed. Sleep was impossible. The snow that provided concealment also soaked through every layer of clothing, leaving crews shivering uncontrollably even as they tried to aim, to load, to fight. Between engagements, those brief moments when they weren't actively trying to kill or avoid being killed, crews huddled in their open turrets and tried to pretend they were still human. They shared cigarettes with fingers so numb they could barely hold them, the tobacco the only warmth in a world of ice. They made jokes that weren't funny but were all they had, dark humor about the cold and the Germans, and their chances of seeing Christmas. They talked about home in short, clipped sentences, careful not to say too much, because talking about home made you think about whether you'd ever see it again. They talked about nothing, just words to fill the silence, to prove they were still alive, still capable of speech. They didn't talk about the Tiger that nearly killed them that morning, or the crew from another M36 that didn't make it back from the last advance, or the dreams they'd started having where they couldn't move fast enough, couldn't load fast enough, couldn't fire before the German gun flashed. But even in the chaos, the M36 proved itself. At Bastogne, Jackson crews helped blunt German advances, their 90mm rounds punching through the flanks of Panthers that thought they were safe. At St. Vith, a single M36 held a crossroads for 3 hours, destroying 2 Tigers and a Panther before withdrawing with its gun nearly too hot to touch. The German advance stalled, bled, collapsed. American infantry learned to love the sound of that deep boom, the 90mm's voice rolling across the battlefield. When a Jackson was nearby, Tigers could die. When a Jackson was nearby, there was hope. As winter gave way to early spring, the M36 legend grew. The long-range kills became the stuff of whispered conversations. An M36 gunner destroying a Panther at 2,000 yards, the German crew probably never even knowing what hit them. Another crew scoring a kill at 2,800 yards, the round traveling so far that by the time they heard the impact, they'd almost forgotten they'd fired. And then the shot that became legend, 4,600 yards. Nearly 3 miles. A Tiger destroyed at a range that seemed impossible, the kind of number that made other crews shake their heads in disbelief. German observers reported it, their own records confirming what seemed like American exaggeration. The 90mm could reach out and kill at distances that rewrote the rules of tank warfare. The psychological impact was profound. German tank crews, who'd spent years as the apex predators of European battlefields, now felt the praise fear. Every engagement could end in a flash of light and instant death from a gun they never saw. The arrogance of 1944 evaporated. German after-action reports spoke respectfully of the new American tank destroyer with the heavy gun. Respect born of fear. Respect earned in blood and fire. By March 1945, the M36s were veterans. Their crews had learned every trick, every advantage, every limitation of their deadly machines. They knew how to use terrain, how to bait German tanks into kill zones, how to coordinate with infantry and other armor. They knew the sound their gun made when it penetrated, the different way a Tiger burned versus a Panther. They knew too much. They'd seen too much. But they kept fighting because the war wasn't over, because the job wasn't done, because their friends were counting on them and home was still an ocean away. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen provided the stage for the M36's final act. American forces had captured the bridge intact, a miracle, a once-in-a-war opportunity to cross the Rhine without a bloody amphibious assault. But the Germans weren't done. They threw everything at Remagen: bombers, artillery, V-2 rockets, and armored counterattacks meant to destroy the bridge or die trying. M36 Jackson tank destroyers took up positions on the east bank, their 90mm guns trained on the approaches. When German armor appeared, trying to fight through to the bridge, the Jacksons opened fire. The 90mm rounds reached across the river valley, found their marks, turned German tanks into burning monuments to a dying Reich. The bridge held. The Americans poured across. The war moved deeper into Germany. In April, as the Reich collapsed and rumors of surrender spread through Allied lines, M36 crews sat in their open turrets and looked across the scarred German landscape. They'd won. They'd survived. The big gun had done its job. But victory felt less like triumph and more like profound exhaustion, like the moment after a fever breaks and you're left weak and wondering if you'll ever feel normal again. They cleaned their guns. They thought about home. They tried not to count the faces missing from crews they'd started with in November. Years later, an M36 gunner would sit in a quiet room, struggling to find words for what it meant, what they'd done, what the war had taken and given. His voice would crack, just slightly, when he said, "We weren't heroes. We were just scared kids behind a big gun. But when that 90 hit, and the Tiger burned, we knew the tide had finally turned." The M36 Jackson wasn't the weapon that won the war. No single weapon ever is. But it was the answer to a question American soldiers had been asking since Normandy. How do we kill a tiger? How do we stop a panther? How do we fight back? The Jackson's 90mm gun provided an answer written in steel and fire. It gave American crews a chance. Not a guarantee, never that, but a fighting chance against the best armor Germany could field. In the calculus of war, where men trade their lives against impossible odds, a fighting chance is everything. The machine itself was a paradox, powerful yet fragile, capable of destroying the mightiest tanks yet vulnerable to almost everything that could shoot back. Its crews lived with that duality every day, felt it in every engagement, understood that their survival depended on getting the first shot and making it count. They were artillerymen who had to fight like cavalrymen, snipers who had to operate in the open, hunters who knew they could become prey in an instant. But the M36 represented something larger than its technical specifications, something beyond kill ratios and penetration data. It was proof that American industry could adapt, could innovate under pressure, could turn desperate need into deadly reality. It was proof that the men who crewed these machines, these scared, determined, ordinary men, could stand against the Wehrmacht's best and win. Not always. Not easily. But often enough. Often enough to matter. In the end, the German gunners stopped laughing. They learned respect for that deep boom echoing across battlefields, for the long gun that could reach out and touch them from distances they thought were safe, for the American crews who learned to aim that gun with lethal precision. The transformation was complete, from mockery to fear, from dominance to doubt, from the arrogant certainty of 1944 to the desperate defensive fighting of 1945. The M36 Jackson and its crews helped write that transformation in fire and smoke and the wreckage of German armor. They weren't the only authors of that story, but their chapter mattered. It mattered to the infantry who advanced behind them. It mattered to the men who died in Shermans, waiting for something that could fight back. It mattered to the boys who climbed into those open turrets, hands shaking with fear and cold, and somehow found the courage to face down tigers. The mud eventually dried. The cold eventually lifted. The guns eventually fell silent. But the memory remained, of scared kids behind a big gun, of the moment the tide turned, of the day German armor learned to fear the American 90. That memory, like the sound of the gun itself, echoed long after the war ended, a testament to ingenuity born of desperation and courage forged in fire.